The village sat nestled at the edge of a vast, sun-kissed kingdom, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the sounds of distant birds echoed in the sky. It was a place where the pulse of life was rooted in tradition, where every morning began with the rhythmic chime of the town bell, and every evening brought with it the gentle murmur of families gathering around flickering fires. Yet beneath the quiet serenity of the village, there lingered a sense of unease, a silent tension that seemed to hang in the air like an invisible fog. Whispers of past glories and forgotten betrayals circled through the streets, woven into the very fabric of the people's lives. The kingdom's once prosperous reign had crumbled, and those who remembered the royal family spoke in hushed tones, careful not to awaken the ghosts of old. Zuwena, the young orphan, was unaware of the complex history that shaped the world around her. She had never known the joy of family, never felt the warmth of a loving home. Her parents had died when she was just a child, leaving her at the mercy of her stepmother, Kehindi. Kehindi was a woman of sharp eyes and a colder heart, a woman whose love could never extend beyond her own ambitions. Zuwena's life had been one of quiet suffering, of silent tears hidden behind a veil of gentleness. Her beauty, though undeniable, was a curse in the eyes of her stepmother, who saw Zuwena's purity and innocence as a threat to her own control. The girl's every movement was scrutinized, her every word twisted into something that suited Kehindi's needs. Zuwena had been taught to serve, to stay in the shadows, to be invisible and quiet. But her heart longed for more than the stone walls of the house, more than the bitter words from Kehindi's lips. Zuwena dreamed of a life beyond the reach of her stepmother's cruelty, of a world where she was free to be herself, free to find her place in a world that had long forgotten her. Zuwena's days were spent in isolation, her every moment dictated by Kehindi's harsh demands. She worked from dawn to dusk, cleaning, cooking, and tending to the needs of a house that never felt like home. But despite the exhaustion that weighed on her young shoulders, there was a quiet strength that Zuena carried within her, a strength born from a deep well of sorrow, but also from a quiet hope. She was not a girl who demanded attention or courted the spotlight. Her beauty was subtle, soft, like the moonlight that fell across the fields at night. She moved with grace, her long, dark hair flowing behind her as she worked. But beneath her outward calm, there was a fire, a hunger for a life of her own. Kehindi, on the other hand, was a woman consumed by her own darkness. Though she had raised Zuena from a child, she did so only out of necessity, not love. Kehindi was a woman who understood power and control, and she saw in Zuena a potential rival. The girl's beauty was something Kehindi could not tolerate, for it reminded her of the life she had lost, the power she had once held. Kehindi had once been a woman of stature, a woman who had known the favour of the king. But that was before the kingdom fell, before the royal family was overthrown, and the land was cast into turmoil. Now she clung to what little influence she had left, controlling Zuena and using her as a pawn to secure her own place in the world. Amir, the man Kehindi had chosen for Zuena, was a mystery in many ways. He was a man of few words, a labourer who worked the fields with calloused hands and a quiet demeanour. He did not speak much of his past, and when he did, his words were always vague, as though he were hiding something. To the villagers, Ameir was just another poor man, someone who had fallen on hard times. But Zuena sensed there was more to him than met the eye. There was something in his eyes, something hidden, something distant. He carried a sadness with him, a weight that seemed to pull at his very soul. What Zuena did not know, however, was that Amir was not the man he appeared to be. He was not just a labourer, not just a poor, dirty man working the fields. He was, in fact, the lost prince of the kingdom, the true heir to a throne that had been stolen from him. His name, long forgotten by most, was Ameir Zuberi. He had been forced into hiding after a violent coup had torn his family apart, leaving him with no choice but to live in the shadows, away from the world that had once belonged to him. Now, disguised as a humble labourer, Ameir waited for the right moment to reveal himself to the world. In the midst of all this, there was King Zubeiri, the lost ruler, whose name had once commanded respect and fear. The king's disappearance had caused a void in the kingdom, one that had yet to be filled. His family's bloodline had been erased from the pages of history, and those who remembered him were few and far between. Some said he had died in battle, others that he had vanished without a trace. But the truth was that King Zubeiri had been betrayed, hidden away by those who sought to claim his throne for themselves. His fate was intertwined with that of Ameir, his son, who carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, even if no one knew his true identity. As Zuena lived out her quiet existence, unaware of the deep connections between herself and the kingdom's lost royal family, the winds of fate were already shifting. The echoes of the past were stirring, and the secrets that lay buried beneath the surface of the village were about to come to light. The story of Zuena, Ameir, Kehindi, and King Zubeiri was only just beginning, and the path that lay before them would be one filled with betrayal, love, and the quest for power. Zuwena's days were a blur of endless chores, a monotonous cycle that left little room for her to dream. Each morning, the rooster's crow signaled the start of her labour. She would rise before the sun, her bare feet touching the cold floor, and shuffle quietly down the stairs to begin the day's work. The house, a modest structure with creaking beams and narrow hallways, always smelled faintly of wood and dust. The small kitchen would greet her with the same demands: sweep the floor, scrub the pots, fetch water from the well. And in the afternoon, when the heat of the sun pressed down on the earth, there were fields to tend to and animals to feed. Kehindi, her stepmother, was never far from her side, watching Zuwena's every move, scrutinizing her actions with hawk-like precision. Kehindi had a way of making everything feel like an accusation. If Zuena failed to wash a dish correctly, or if a thread in the sewing broke, Kehindi would lash out, her words sharp as thorns. There was no kindness in her stepmother's voice, no affection in her gaze. Zuwena's existence was nothing more than a tool for her stepmother's ambitions, a tool to be used and discarded when no longer useful. Zuena was no stranger to harsh words. Kehindi's tongue was a weapon, always ready to strike. "Lazy girl," she would mutter. "You're good for nothing but cleaning and cooking. Do you think the world owes you kindness just because you've lost your parents?" Kehindi's bitterness always seeped through, the jealousy that smouldered within her, making every comment sting deeper than the last. There were days when Zuwena could hardly remember the last time anyone had spoken to her kindly. No words of praise for the hard work she put in, no gesture of love or understanding. She was a shadow, a silent figure who did as she was told, never asking for anything in return. Her heart grew heavy with every passing day, the weight of her quiet suffering pressing down on her chest. She worked tirelessly, driven by some vague hope that one day, somehow, things might change. But deep down, she knew it wasn't likely. Kehindi's cruelty was a constant, an unyielding force that seemed to consume everything in its path. But there was one thing Kehindi could never take from her: Zuwena's beauty. It was a gift her stepmother could not control, no matter how hard she tried. Zuwena's beauty was not just physical. It was a quiet, serene kind of beauty, the kind that seemed to glow from within. Her long, raven-black hair, her gentle features, and the softness in her brown eyes were all qualities that made her stand out in the village. Yet, it was her innocence that Kehindi found most unbearable. There was something pure about Zuwena's soul, something that seemed to shine brighter than the bitterness that consumed her stepmother. Kehindi saw in Zuwena a rival, someone who could undo everything she had worked so hard to manipulate. Zuwena's purity was a threat to Kehindi's power, her innocence a sharp contrast to the calculated cruelty that had become Kehindi's life. She feared that one day someone might look at Zuena the way they had once looked at her, admiring her for her grace, her beauty, her quiet strength. It was a fear that ate away at her, a fear that made her lash out even more. Late at night, when the house was still and the sounds of the world outside had faded into silence, Zuena would lay in bed and stare up at the thatched ceiling. She would listen to the creak of the floorboards and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Her mind would wander to far-off places, to dreams of freedom and escape. She imagined running away from the house, running far from Kehindi's cruelty. In her mind's eye, she saw herself standing on a hilltop, looking out over the kingdom, her heart light with the joy of knowing she was free. But as much as she longed for escape, Zuena knew it was impossible. Where could she go? She had no family, no one to turn to. The village was a small, isolated place, and leaving would mean stepping into the unknown, a frightening prospect for someone like her. So she stayed. She stayed because there was no other choice. Yet, even in the darkest moments of despair, Zuena held on to a secret hope. Deep down, she believed that there had to be more to life than this. She believed that one day, something would change, that the cruelty of her stepmother would one day be undone. And in those rare moments when the weight of her reality seemed too much to bear, Zuena would close her eyes and dream of a different life. A life where she could be free, where she could be loved, where she could be more than just a servant to someone's whims. She would imagine meeting someone who saw her for who she truly was, someone who valued her not for her beauty or her usefulness, but for the kindness in her heart. She imagined a love that was gentle, a love that would shelter her from the harshness of the world, a love that would give her the courage to rise above the cruelty of her stepmother's world. But those dreams, as sweet as they were, always felt far away. The nights grew colder, the shadows deeper, and Zuwena's world remained unchanged. It was a life of endless labor and silent suffering, a life in which she was trapped. Yet, in her heart, she could not abandon the hope that one day, someone would come, someone who would change everything. The day Kehindi chose to speak of the marriage had arrived, and with it, a coldness that settled over the house. Zuena had been working in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough, when Kehindi entered, her presence like a storm on the horizon. There was a look in her eyes, calculating, cold. "I've arranged for you to marry," Kehindi announced, as though speaking of nothing more significant than the weather. Zuena froze, her hands stilling on the dough. She had heard the whispers, seen the way Kehindi had been eyeing certain men in the village. But she had hoped, no, prayed, that she would have a choice, that her future would not be dictated by someone else's desires. Kehindi's voice broke into her thoughts. "You're to marry Amir, the labourer. It's time for you to secure a future, as an ideal match, humble, hard-working, and not someone who will challenge my place in this household." Zuwena's heart sank. Amir, the quiet labourer who worked in the fields, whose name was rarely spoken in the village without a nod to his poor station. He was no one, a shadow of a man, unnoticed by most. And yet, Kehindi saw him as the perfect match for Zuena, someone so far beneath her that there could be no threat to Kehindi's own control. Zuena didn't know how to feel. She had always known this day would come, but she had never thought it would be so soon, and certainly not in such a cold, heartless way. She had never thought she would be married off like this, to a man she hardly knew, someone who seemed so indifferent to her, to everything. She couldn't imagine a life with him. How could she? The very thought filled her with a hollow ache. "But I don't want to marry him," Zuena said softly, almost in a whisper. The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken emotion. Kehindi's face twisted into a frown, and her sharp gaze narrowed. "What you want does not matter, Zuena. Your desires are irrelevant. I have made this decision, and it will be done." Zuena lowered her head. Her stepmother's words were final, and Zuena knew better than to protest. She had no choice. She had never truly had a choice in anything. The idea of defying Kehindi was terrifying. And even if she did, where would she go? What could she do? There was no escape, not from her stepmother's hold, and certainly not from the village that had known her since she was a child. So, she did as she was told. She didn't fight it. She simply walked through the motions, letting the days pass by like a slow, aching blur. The wedding day arrived with little fanfare. There was no grand celebration, no music or dancing. The air was thick with the stillness of an impending storm. Zuwena was dressed in a simple, modest gown, one that was far from the beautiful flowing dresses she had once imagined wearing. The fabric was plain, the colour a washed-out shade of pale blue, almost as if it had been forgotten in a drawer for years. Her hair was tied back tightly, and she wore a nervous expression on her face as she stood by the door, waiting. When she saw Amir for the first time that day, her heart skipped a beat, not in excitement, but in dread. He was standing at the front of the small gathering, his back straight and his face emotionless. He didn't even look at her when she entered the room. He barely acknowledged her presence. And there, in the small room, filled only with a few close villagers, the awkwardness settled between them like a thick fog. Zuwena tried to keep her gaze from meeting his. She didn't want to see the indifference in his eyes, didn't want to feel the emptiness that seemed to surround him. What was the point of this ceremony? She had heard nothing from him, no words of comfort, no promises of love. He seemed as resigned to the marriage as she was, as though it were simply a matter of course, something that had to be done. The ceremony itself was a blur of words, the officiant's voice distant and muffled. Zuena barely heard the vows, her mind too consumed with thoughts of what lay ahead. She only nodded when she was asked to do so, repeating the words she had been instructed to say. When it was Ameir's turn to speak, his voice was barely audible, just a soft murmur that didn't carry any warmth. He said the vows without emotion, as though they were nothing more than a formality. Zuwena's heart ached as she stood there, a silent observer of her own life unfolding. She had no idea what the future would hold, but in that moment, she knew it would not be a future filled with love or joy. She felt empty, a shell of a person, as though she were floating through the motions of a life she hadn't chosen. The thought of spending her life with a man who didn't care for her, who barely acknowledged her existence, felt like an unbearable weight. When the ceremony ended and the small gathering began to disperse, Zuwena didn't feel any different. There was no celebration, no relief. She was simply married, bound to a man who was as distant and cold as the walls around her. The future stretched out before her like an endless road, dark and uncertain. And in that moment, as she walked away from the ceremony with Amir at her side, Zuwena realized that this was her life now. It was a life without passion, without love, but it was her life nonetheless. As the days passed after the wedding, Zuwena couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. Amir, the man she had been forced to marry, was nothing like she had expected. His quiet demeanour had initially seemed like a blessing, a reprieve from her stepmother's harshness, but it soon began to unsettle her in ways she couldn't explain. It wasn't just his silence. There was something about him that didn't quite fit. At first, Zuena had chalked it up to the fact that he was simply a man of few words, someone who kept his thoughts to himself. But over time, small things began to stand out. His movements were too graceful for a common labourer. There was a fluidity to his actions, a natural ease that seemed out of place in the rough surroundings of the village. His strength, too, was extraordinary. Though he never boasted or displayed his abilities openly, Zuena had seen him lift heavy loads with minimal effort, his arms rippling with power beneath his simple tunic. But the most peculiar thing of all was his knowledge. Amir would sometimes speak in ways that made Zuena pause. He knew things that seemed beyond the scope of someone with his humble background. He could read the stars with ease, his eyes following the patterns of the night sky as if he had been trained to do so. He spoke of distant lands with a familiarity that suggested he had travelled extensively. The way he described certain places Zuwena had never heard of, made her wonder if he had lived a life far more complex than the one he had let on. At first, Zuwena dismissed her thoughts. She told herself that perhaps it was simply the mystery of a new life that had caused her to look at him with suspicion. But the more time passed, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was hiding. Something important. Her suspicions only deepened one evening when she overheard a conversation in the village square. It was a quiet moment, the sun having just dipped below the horizon, and most of the villagers were gathered in small groups, talking about the day's events. Zuwena had been on her way to the market when she overheard a group of older women gossiping in hushed tones. "I heard a rumour," one of the women whispered. "They say there's a prince hiding in this very village. A lost prince, overthrown and cast aside." Zuwena's ears pricked up at the mention of a prince. She had heard the stories, the tales of royal bloodlines and the downfall of kings, but never had she thought they could have anything to do with her. Still, the words lingered in her mind, and she strained to listen. "There's a royal bloodline, you know," another woman chimed in, her voice barely audible above the hum of the crowd. "The kingdom was overthrown many years ago, and they say the prince still lives among us, disguised as one of the common folk, so they won't find him." Zuwena's heart began to race. Her mind flashed to Amir. The pieces of the puzzle she had been struggling to put together were beginning to fall into place. Could it be? Was it possible that Amir, the quiet, unassuming labourer, was actually the lost prince the village spoke of? But the whispers didn't mention his name directly. They spoke only of rumours, half-truths, and guesses. Zuwena tried to push the thought away, but it gnawed at her. The idea that the man she had married might be hiding a secret far beyond her comprehension. She had to know the truth. For days, Zuwena quietly observed Amir, looking for any sign that might confirm her suspicions. She asked him questions, innocuous ones at first, about his past, about where he had come from. But he always deflected, his answers vague and unhelpful. When she asked about his family, his eyes would darken, and he would fall silent, his jaw tightening, as though the very mention of his past caused him pain. Despite his evasiveness, Zuwena couldn't let it go. She began to ask others in the village about him, hoping to find some clue. But every time she inquired, people would look at her with pity, as if they knew something she didn't, but were too afraid to speak of it. It wasn't until she stumbled upon an old man one evening that she got a glimpse of the truth. The man had been a servant in the palace long before it had fallen, and when Zuwena asked about Amir, he looked at her with a knowing expression. "Don't you see it?" the old man asked, his voice hoarse with age. "The way he carries himself, the way he holds himself, even when he's among the poor. It's in his blood. Amir is not like the others. He's a prince. He's been hiding in plain sight for years." Zuwena's mind raced as the old man's words sank in. She couldn't believe it. Amir, her husband, the quiet labourer she had married out of duty, was not who he seemed. He was royalty, a lost prince with a history she couldn't even begin to fathom. But why had he kept it a secret? And more importantly, why had he married her? Zuwena's obsession with uncovering the truth grew with each passing day. Every conversation with Ameir seemed like a riddle she couldn't solve, every glance a clue she couldn't decipher. She found herself waking up at night, her mind racing with questions, with doubts. She had to know who Ameir really was, and why he had kept his past hidden for so long. But Ameir was always careful, always just out of reach. He was an enigma, and the more Zuwena tried to uncover the truth, the more elusive it became. The mystery only deepened, and with it, Zuwena's obsession. She could no longer think of anything else. She had to discover the secret he had been hiding all these years, no matter the cost. The tension that had been building between Zuwena and Ameir finally reached its breaking point one quiet evening. After days of trying to uncover the truth, After hours of subtle questioning and watching his every move, Zuena felt a strange pull in her heart. She had long suspected that there was something hidden within him, something more than the unassuming man who stood before her each day. But no amount of time spent observing or asking had prepared her for what would come next. It was late in the evening, and the house was quiet. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind outside, carrying with it the cool breeze of the night. Zuena sat by the window, her gaze lost in the distance, when Amir entered the room. His steps were soft, but there was a heaviness to his presence, as though something weighed on him more than usual. He stood there for a long moment, as though contemplating whether to speak or remain silent. Zuena, sensing his internal struggle, didn't press him. Instead, she simply waited, allowing the silence to stretch between them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Amir spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "I need to tell you something," he began, his words filled with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I owe you the truth." Zuwena's heart skipped a beat, sensing the gravity of his words. She turned toward him, her breath catching in her chest. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft yet filled with an anxious curiosity. Ameir hesitated, his eyes looking anywhere but at her. He seemed as though he was struggling to find the right words, as though the confession he was about to make was the heaviest burden he had ever carried. Zuena watched him, her pulse quickening, as she instinctively knew that something profound was about to be revealed. "I am not the man you think I am," Amir continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is not Ameir. It's Ameir Zuberi." Zuena blinked, the unfamiliar name hanging in the air like an enigma. It took a moment for the weight of his words to fully sink in, but when it did, it hit her like a thunderclap. Zuberi. She had heard that name before, rumors of a royal bloodline, whispers of a kingdom lost to time, a bloodline that had been overthrown in a brutal coup. Her mind raced as Amir continued to speak, each word unraveling the mystery that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. "I am the lost prince of the kingdom that was taken from us," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers, revealing the pain that had been buried within him for so long. "My family was murdered in the coup, and I was forced to flee, to hide. I changed my name and my identity, living in the shadows to survive." Zuena could hardly breathe. Her world seemed to tilt on its axis, as if the earth beneath her feet had shifted. She had married a prince, a royal heir, the very man the village had whispered about in secret, the man whose existence had been nothing more than a legend until now. Her thoughts swirled in a dizzying whirl of confusion, disbelief, and something else, something deeper. She struggled to reconcile the man she had married with the image of a prince, a ruler whose bloodline was tied to a throne she couldn't even imagine. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. She looked at him with a mix of emotions: shock, excitement, betrayal. "Why did you keep this from me?" Amir's gaze dropped to the floor, as though he couldn't bear to look her in the eye. "I never wanted you to marry me because of who I was," he said quietly. "I wanted you to marry me because of who I am now, the man I've become, not the man I once was. I thought you would never accept me if you knew the truth." Zuwena's heart swelled with conflicting emotions. Part of her felt a rush of excitement, a flood of wonder at the thought of being married to a prince, to someone with such a profound and noble history. But another part of her felt betrayed, even hurt, that the man she had married had kept such an important secret from her. "I never knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never knew any of this." Amir nodded, his expression one of deep regret. "I wanted to protect you from my past, from the dangers it still brings. But I can't keep running forever, Zuena. I can't hide who I am anymore." For a long moment, the silence between them felt heavy. Zuwena's mind spun with the enormity of what she had just learned. She thought back to the stories she had heard growing up, Tales of a lost kingdom, of a prince who had vanished from the world, of a family whose bloodline had been all but erased. She never imagined that she would be connected to such a story, and yet here she was, sitting before the very man who was part of that forgotten history. Despite the shock and the uncertainty, something shifted between them in that moment. Zuwena saw Ameir not just as a man hiding a secret, but as someone who had suffered, someone who had lost everything. He was a man torn between two worlds, one that had been destroyed and one that he was building from the ground up. As she looked into his eyes, Zuwena felt a connection, a bond that was stronger than any title or lineage. He wasn't just the lost prince. He was Amir, her husband, the man she had come to care for despite the mystery and the secrets. Slowly, Zuwena reached out and took his hand in hers, her fingers trembling. "We'll face this together," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling within her. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Ameir's gaze softened, and for the first time, he allowed himself to smile. It was a quiet, fragile smile, but it was enough. He squeezed her hand gently. "Yes," he said, "together." And in that moment, Zuwena realized that the journey ahead of them would be one of uncertainty, but it would also be one of discovery. They would uncover the truth of his past and face the challenges that lay ahead, but they would do it side by side, united by a bond that was stronger than any secret. Zuwena's discovery came one evening as she was quietly searching through the small, hidden compartment in the back of the cupboard. She had been hearing whispers from the other villagers, and some of their words had finally come to make sense. Amir's true identity had shaken her, but it had also spurred her to question everything, including the motives of the woman who had raised her, her stepmother, Kehindi. The journal she found was old and worn, its pages yellowed with age, but it was undeniably a record of the past. As Zuwena read through it, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The entries were written in a hurried hand, but they were clear enough to paint a horrifying picture. The coup that had overthrown Ameir's family wasn't a random act of violence. It had been carefully orchestrated, and the name that kept appearing in those pages was none other than Kehindi. Zuwena's breath hitched as she turned each page. Kehindi had not only been involved in the coup, but she had actively sought power, using her manipulative charms to align herself with the right people. She had played a key role in the fall of Amir's family, ensuring that they were killed and that their kingdom was left vulnerable. The realization hit Zuwena like a lightning strike. Her stepmother, the woman who had raised her, who had told her that everything was done out of love and care, had been responsible for the destruction of an entire family. And now, it seemed, she was using Zuwena herself as a tool in her power game. Zuwena felt the weight of betrayal sink deep within her chest. The woman who had been the only family she had known, the one who had claimed to be protecting her, had been manipulating her all along. With the journal in her hands, Zuwena's mind raced. She felt as though the very ground beneath her had been pulled away. She had been nothing more than a pawn in Kehindi's twisted game, a pawn she had used to keep herself in control. Zuwena had spent years working under her stepmother's cruelty, doing as she was told, never questioning the authority that Kehindi imposed on her. But now, the truth of the situation burned in her heart like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. Kehindi's behavior, which had always been harsh and overbearing, took on a darker tone in the weeks that followed. Zuwena noticed her stepmother's actions becoming increasingly erratic and desperate. Kehindi began to lash out more, using threats and harsh commands to control Zuwena. Her jealousy of Ameir, who had begun to show signs of regaining his power, grew. The closer Ameir got to uncovering the truth of his heritage, the more vicious and tyrannical Kehindi became. Zuwena could see that her stepmother was afraid that the prince might reclaim his throne, and that her carefully crafted life of deceit would come crashing down. Kehindi had always been ambitious, but now, that ambition was turning into something more dangerous. She would stop at nothing to maintain control, even if it meant using Zuwena to carry out her plans. One night, As Zuwena was returning from a trip to the village, she overheard a conversation between her stepmother and one of her allies. They were discussing a plan to dispose of Ameir once and for all. The words that reached Zuwena's ears were laced with venom, and she felt her stomach turn with disgust. It was clear that Kehindi saw Ameir as nothing more than a threat to be eliminated, and she would stop at nothing to make sure he never returned to the throne. The realization cut deep. Kehindi had been manipulating Zuwena from the start, using her as a weapon to further her own goals. Zuwena had always been the pawn in this deadly game, but now she could no longer stand idly by. Zuwena's dilemma grew more complicated with each passing day. On one side, there was her stepmother, Kehindi, who had raised her, protected her, and promised her a future of stability. But Zuwena could no longer deny the truth. Kehindi had always used her. She had been nothing more than a tool for her stepmother's ambition. On the other side stood Amir, the man who had been her husband, and who, she now realized, was the rightful heir to a throne that had been stolen from him. As Zuwena grappled with the weight of the choices before her, she realized that the battle she faced wasn't just one of loyalty. It was a battle for her very soul. Could she continue to live under the shadow of her stepmother's control, knowing the depth of her treachery? Or would she stand by the man she now loved, the man who had been wronged by Kahindi, and help him reclaim his birthright? Zuwena's thoughts were clouded with confusion and pain. But one thing was clear. Her decision could change everything. If she sided with Ameir, she would be defying her stepmother and risking her own safety. But if she sided with Kahindi, she would be complicit in the destruction of the man she had come to love. The clock was ticking, and Zuwena knew that time was running out. She had to make her choice. Would she continue to follow her stepmother's orders? Or would she take a stand for what was right, even if it meant losing everything she had known? It was a decision that would define the rest of her life, and she could no longer delay it. Amir stood before the window of the small cottage where he and Zuwena had been hiding, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. His plan was beginning to take shape, but he knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The kingdom that had once been his was now under the iron grip of Kehindi, a woman who would do anything to hold on to power, no matter the cost. He turned to Zuwena, who was quietly tending to their meager dinner. She had become his greatest ally, his partner in the battle for the throne that was rightfully his. He had learned to trust her, not just because of her love for him, but because of the strength and courage she had shown since learning of his true identity. Zuwena, who had once been a quiet and obedient girl under her stepmother's control, had blossomed into a fierce and capable woman, one who would stand beside him as they fought to reclaim his kingdom. Ameir. Zuwena's voice was soft but resolute as she approached him. You know that this won't be easy. Kehindi will stop at nothing to keep the throne, even if it means destroying us both. Ameir nodded grimly. He had spent years in hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike. But now that the time had come, the challenges seemed insurmountable. Kehindi had surrounded herself with loyal followers, spies who were constantly watching every move he and Zuwena made. She had built a network of conspirators, all with one goal: to ensure that Ameir never returned to the throne. We have to move carefully, Amir said, his voice low with determination. Every step we take must be planned. We can't afford any mistakes. Zuwena nodded, her brow furrowing in thought. And I will help you. I won't let her win. The bond between them had only grown stronger as they worked together. Zuwena's loyalty was unwavering, and Ameir had come to rely on her instincts and wisdom. She had already proven herself in countless ways, from overhearing Kehindi's conversations to helping him gather the support they needed from those loyal to the royal family. Zuena had become more than just his wife. She had become his confidant, his partner in every sense of the word. As the days passed, their plans began to take form. Amir knew that, in order to reclaim his throne, he would have to gather allies from all corners of the kingdom. He could no longer trust the royal court, for Kehindi had already poisoned their hearts with lies. The nobles who had once supported his family had either been silenced or corrupted by her promises of power. But there were still those who remembered the old kingdom, those who longed for the return of the true heir. They began to send messages in secret, carefully choosing who to trust. Ameir knew that the journey ahead would be perilous, but he was determined to succeed. The kingdom that had once been a beacon of peace and prosperity could not remain in the hands of a usurper like Kahindi. But Kahindi, as always, was one step ahead. She had spies everywhere, and it wasn't long before she learned of Ameir's movements. Her network of informants had already begun to track every conversation, every letter, and every meeting he held. It wasn't long before Zuwena became a target, as Kehindi saw her as the greatest threat to her hold on power. Ameir and Zuwena had no choice but to move in secret, using false identities and avoiding any contact that might reveal their location. The tension between them and Kehindi's forces grew with each passing day, and soon the entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Zuwena could feel the weight of the danger pressing down on her. It was no longer just about reclaiming Ameir's birthright. It was about survival. Kehindi was ruthless, and she would stop at nothing to keep the throne. Zuwena knew that the stakes had never been higher, and the consequences of failure would be devastating. Despite the mounting tension, Zuwena remained resolute. She could no longer stay in the shadows, hiding from the woman who had controlled her life for so long. She had chosen her path, and there was no turning back. Ameir was the man she loved, and his cause was just. Together, they would fight for his throne, for the kingdom that had been taken from him, and for the future they hoped to build. But as the night drew near, and their plans continued to unfold, they both knew that the road ahead would be filled with danger, betrayal, and uncertainty. Kehindi's grip on the kingdom was tightening, and the final battle for the throne was about to begin. The royal palace, once a symbol of wealth and grandeur, now stood as a shadow of its former self, its golden walls tarnished by years of corruption. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, a sense of impending doom hanging over every room. It was the moment of truth, the final battle for the kingdom's fate. Amir and Zuwena stood together in a quiet corridor, the weight of the upcoming confrontation pressing heavily on their shoulders. They had fought long and hard to get here, overcoming countless obstacles, but they knew that the most dangerous challenge awaited them in the heart of the palace. Kehindi's plots had been carefully orchestrated for years, and now it was time for them to face the woman who had torn their lives apart. "We have no choice now," Ameir said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet urgency. "This ends today." Zuwena nodded, her hand tightening around his. With you. We've come too far to turn back." As they approached the grand hall where Kehindi had taken her position as the ruler of the kingdom, they could hear the sounds of the court echoing through the palace. The nobles and courtiers were all gathered, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity, unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. Inside the hall, Kehindi sat at the head of the long table, a cruel smile playing on her lips. She had always been a master of manipulation, and she knew that the moment she allowed Ameir to return to the throne, her own reign would be over. She had already set her final plan into motion. Amir would not leave the palace alive. As Zuwena and Ameir entered the hall, the room fell into a tense silence. Kehindi's eyes flickered to them, a sneer curling on her lips. She had been prepared for this, knowing that Ameir would try to reclaim his birthright, but she was ready. She had made arrangements to have him killed the moment he set foot inside the palace. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine?" Kehindi's voice was cold, her eyes narrowing with hatred. Amir stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "This kingdom was never yours, Kehindi. It was mine by birthright, and I will take it back." Kehindi's smile widened, but it was a smile full of malice. "You're too late. The kingdom belongs to me now. And you, my dear husband, will not leave this palace alive." With a snap of her fingers, her guards moved swiftly toward Ameir, their swords drawn. But before they could strike, Zuwena stepped forward, her face fierce with determination. "No!" she shouted, her voice ringing through the hall. "I will not let you harm him." In that instant, Zuwena made a choice. She had been a passive participant in her own life for far too long, but now, standing beside the man she loved, she would not be silenced any longer. She would fight for her kingdom, for the future of the people, and for the man who had shown her what true love and loyalty meant. Zuwena's quick thinking and courage caught Kehindi off guard. She had underestimated the bond between Ameir and Zuwena, and now it was too late. As the guards advanced, Zuwena grabbed a nearby sword, slashing through the air with precision and skill that surprised even her. She fought with everything she had, not just to protect Amir, but to bring down the corrupt woman who had controlled her life for far too long. The battle was swift and brutal, the clash of steel echoing through the palace. Amir, despite his initial hesitation, fought alongside Zuwena with a renewed sense of purpose. His past, his royal bloodline, had never been about the throne. It had been about the people. And now, with Zuwena by his side, he would fight for them, just as he had promised. The guards, unable to withstand the combined strength of Zuwena and Ameir, quickly fell back. Kehindi, realizing that her plans had failed, attempted to flee, but it was too late. Amir was upon her in a heartbeat, his hand gripping her arm as he dragged her before the gathered nobles. "You have betrayed your kingdom, your people, and your own blood," Ameir declared, his voice cold but resolute. "For your crimes, you will be punished." Zuwena stood beside him, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what they had to do. But she had made her decision, and she would stand by Ameir until the end. The truth had been revealed, and Kehindi's reign of terror was over. As the kingdom's people gathered outside the palace, word of the victory spread like wildfire. The tyrant had been toppled, and the rightful heir had reclaimed his throne. The celebration that followed was not just a victory for Amir, but for Zuwena as well. She had chosen love, loyalty, and justice over fear and manipulation. Amir took the throne with Zuwena at his side, their bond stronger than ever. Together, they ruled with wisdom and compassion, bringing peace and prosperity back to the kingdom. And though their journey had been fraught with hardship, they knew that their love had been the greatest weapon they had. The kingdom would never forget the story of the lost prince and the brave woman who helped him reclaim his destiny. The kingdom, once ravaged by lies and deceit, now stood on the brink of a new era, one shaped by wisdom, justice, and love. Amir had ascended to the throne, and with him came a peace that had long been absent. The once grand palace, which had borne witness to countless betrayals and political turmoil, now echoed with the sound of celebration and hope. The people, weary from years of suffering, looked to their new king with gratitude and admiration, knowing that the future was brighter than ever before. Amir, though deeply humbled by his trials, embraced his role as king with dignity. He ruled with a steady hand, never forgetting the lessons of his past. His heart, once heavy with the weight of betrayal, now beat with a renewed sense of purpose. He sought not only to rebuild the kingdom's wealth, but to restore its soul. His leadership brought prosperity to the land, and his decisions were always made with the welfare of the people in mind. Under his reign, the kingdom flourished, its borders expanded, its culture revived, and its people's spirits lifted. But Ameir's greatest triumph lay not in the power he held, but in the love he had found. Zuwena, the woman who had once been a quiet orphan, now stood at his side as queen. Her transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. Where once there had been fear and uncertainty, there was now strength and purpose. Zuwena had become more than just a queen by title. She had become a powerful force in her own right. Her wisdom, Compassion and courage were evident in every decision she made, and the people admired her for her grace and unwavering commitment to the kingdom. The love between Zuwena and Amir had grown stronger with each passing day. Their bond, once tested by betrayal and hardship, was now unbreakable. They were not only partners in marriage, but partners in ruling the kingdom. Together, they made decisions that were fair and just, always putting the needs of the people above their own desires. Their love was the foundation of their reign, and it radiated through every corner of the kingdom. Zuwena had found her place beside Ameir, not as a mere accessory to his power, but as a leader in her own right. She had shed the weight of her painful past, the cruelty of her stepmother, the burden of being an orphan, and had emerged as a woman of strength and dignity. She had chosen to embrace her destiny, and in doing so, she had found not only love, but purpose. Her life, once defined by struggle and sorrow, was now one of fulfillment and joy. In the years that followed, the kingdom continued to thrive. The people lived in peace, their hearts filled with hope for the future. Amir and Zuwena's reign was marked by prosperity, justice, and compassion. They worked tirelessly to ensure that every citizen, from the humblest laborer to the wealthiest merchant, had a voice in the kingdom's decisions. They restored harmony to the land, making it a place where dreams could be realized and love could flourish. For Zuwena, the greatest reward was the life she had built with Ameir. Her painful past was finally behind her, and she stood proudly beside the man who had not only claimed his birthright, but had helped her claim hers. She had been more than just a pawn in a cruel game of power. She had become the queen of her own destiny. The once timid girl, who had known nothing but cruelty and hardship, was now a symbol of strength, resilience, and love. As Amir and Zuwena looked out over the kingdom they had rebuilt together, they knew that their love had been the key to their success. It was their love that had overcome every obstacle, their love that had healed the wounds of the past, and their love that would carry them into the future. The kingdom, once fractured and torn, was now united, and it stood as a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and the courage to fight for what was right. Zuwena's journey had come full circle. From a poor orphan under the cruel hand of her stepmother to the queen of a flourishing kingdom, she had found her place in the world. And she knew, as she stood beside Amir, that their love would continue to guide them, as it always had, into a future full of promise and possibility. Together, they had built a kingdom where hope reigned supreme, and where love was the greatest force of all.